Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. I am Miri Eisin and I will be replacing Jonathan Hessen as the program's host for this week. Over the last few weeks, we have watched Iran practice an offensive military exercise focused against Israel. Iran fired rockets they claim can reach Israel and emphasized that Israel is the target. Yet as we speak, the diplomatic effort to arrive at an agreement with the Islamic regime of Iran about the nuclear issue is scheduled to continue in Vienna. What kind of concessions will be made to Iran as the world tries to curtail the Iranian nuclear program? To discuss these challenging issues, we have with us today the following experts: Dr. Raz Zimmet, Iran expert at the INSS. Hello, Raz.
Hi there.
Also with us, Mr. Meir Javedanfar, lecturer on Iran at Reichman University. Hello, Meir.
Hello.
But first, let us hear from our in-house expert and host of TV7's Powers and Play, Mr. Amir Oren, for a deeper understanding of the subject. Amir, please.
So had it been a movie rather than a panel discussion, we would have looked at the diplomats going into the hall in Vienna, not the Americans. They are in a back room. They are not meeting directly with the Iranians, even though there is probably some circuit back channel. And the score would have been drum beating and saber rattling. Now, this 2022 is probably the year of decision regarding whether diplomacy will work. And more to the point, we are in a quarter of decision because it cannot go on much longer. The Iranian economy will not withstand more than several additional months of pressure, and the world powers will not let the Iranian tactics of stalling and all the time getting more expertise and perhaps more fissile material accumulated. So everyone understands that it's time to fish or cut bait.
Fish or cut bait. So, Raz, I'd like to ask you a bit more about what Amir just called Iran's stalling tactics. Could you give us a better understanding of what Iran would like to achieve in the diplomatic rounds in Vienna? What does it mean, stalling tactics? What are they trying to achieve?
Well, I think the main objective of the Iranians is very simple. They want the sanctions to be removed. All the sanctions, or most of the sanctions imposed by Trump, and by that they mean not just the sanctions reimposed after Trump decided to leave the deal, but all the sanctions, even if they are not related to the nuclear program of Iran. Having said that, they want the sanctions to be removed before any kind of Iranian going back to its commitments to the JCPOA. And they also want some guarantees that that first of all, that no future U.S. administration, especially if the Republicans go back in 3 years, they are not going to leave the JCPOA again. And if they do so, they certainly want to have some, I would say, economic or technical guarantees that sanctions are not going to be removed only on paper, but they will, but that Iran will be able to get the fruits of the sanctions relief, because as some of us remember, even after the 2015 JCPOA, there were voices in Iran, including by Supreme Leader Khamenei, saying that yes, the sanctions were removed, but most of Iran's efforts to be engaged in new deals with investors or companies, especially from Europe, did not materialize due to certain problems, both in the Iranian economy and in the way the Europeans were ready to make business with Iran. So the bottom line, they want sanctions relief, and they want to make sure that they will be able to use those sanctions in any case, even if there is a new president in the United States in 3 years, will decide to again withdraw from the JCPOA.
So that's very clear in that sense. And Meir, what I'd like to ask you is the implications of the sanctions. We always talk about Iran wanting to remove the sanctions. Can you take us deeper into Iran and try and give us a picture of what these sanctions have done to Iran, to the Iranian people? Let's be more specific about what this means there to the economy and, as I said, to the Iranian people.
Thank you. First of all, just one other point, if I can add to Raz's comments regarding the sticking points. Another sticking point between Iran and the P5+1 is the question of centrifuges. Iran has deployed a number of very advanced centrifuges, which after Trump walked out of the deal, and the two sides are having a hard time coming to an agreement. Some of the members of the P5+1 want these new advanced centrifuges to be destroyed, while there's a compromise being talked about that while Iran wants to basically store them away. So there's a compromise being discussed as is that, perhaps they will just remove the wiring and the electric supplies to these centrifuges in order to disable them. But so far we have not reached a solution, so that's another issue between the two. Regarding the sanctions have caused Iran is not able to sell its oil, and for the last 42 years, unfortunately, Iran still continues to use oil as its biggest export earner, even though Iran has a lot of capacities, but the regime has failed to diversify Iran's economy away. So one of the biggest impact of the sanctions has been Iran's inability to export oil on the international market. And this has been this has hit the Iranian economy in a major way. Another impact of the sanctions has been inability to get investment from other countries in Iran's economy, especially in its energy sector. These oil fields in Iran are getting old. They need to be serviced. Iran's energy sector and automotive sector, which are the biggest employers in Iran's economy, need upgrading the infrastructure and the equipment, and this is not happening. Another impact, of course, is the inability to make payments to international banks. And this is, of course, hurting the Iranian population in a great way. But at the same time, I have to say that the Iranian regime's own policies, such as refusing to ratify the FATF, Financial Action Task Force, which is against money laundering, this has also made it very difficult for Iran for people to make transfers and for Iranian companies to make international transfers. And of course, the issue of corruption. There are some elements within the Iranian regime who do not want all sanctions to be removed because they make a very handsome profit by having a monopolistic hold over Iran's economy. An example I could give you of how some people in Iran don't want all the sanctions to be removed is a statement made by Ismail Haniyeh. He publicly stated that Iran gives $70 million to Hamas. I think it's impossible for Haniyeh to reveal such a secret without Iranian permission. Why do some Iranians want Hamas to say this? Because there are certain sectors of the IRGC who want some of the sanctions to remain so that Iran's economy will be closed off, so that the Iranian consumer can only buy the products produced by their companies and not foreign companies.
And as we take that there, and as I'm looking at this, I'm wondering, Amir, where Israel comes into this whole aspect. How does Israel impact the diplomatic front? How do we view in that sense also the sanctions and the removal or possible removal of sanctions in the aftermath of this diplomatic effort?
Well, the Israeli cabinet, which was formed last June and is supposed to stay in office for another 4 years, almost 4 years from now, is a status quo government. It is not going to have any initiative anywhere, including on the Iranian front. Now, verbally, of course, we hear all sorts of announcements and threats, but Israel is basically dependent on the United States. It does not make sense to believe that Israel is going to get for free, not to buy, but to get so much equipment from the United States, F-35s, tanker aircraft necessary for long-range flights, helicopters, and many other items without strings attached. Israel cannot, in practice, undertake such an operation without American acquiescence, at least, if not coordination. So the problem goes back to Washington. And in Washington, President Biden starts this year from a disadvantage on several fronts. First of all, domestically, he is vulnerable going into the midterm elections. One need not analyze it further. Then militarily, his policy is not to start new wars. You cannot undertake a single operation against Iran without planning for a contingency which will draw America into another war. And then diplomatically, we are talking about Iran as if this is the single most important issue on the global plate. But in order to succeed vis-à-vis Iran in the talks, the United States needs Chinese and Russian cooperation. At the same time, it is confronting these two powers on Taiwan, on the Ukraine, and several other issues. So Biden will have to be a diplomatic wizard to do everything and come out of the Iran negotiations with a trophy.
When we talk about a trophy and we talk about the United States involvement, Raz, how do you think the Iranians view what's going on? What are their actions when it comes to the U.S., Russia, China, all of these different actors playing in between them? Are they trying in their diplomacy to really use these differences in the world right now for their own diplomatic efforts?
Well, first of all, there is a very interesting domestic discussions right now in Iran between the so-called more pragmatic elements within Iran who say that the Russians are playing too significant role in the negotiations. And some of them at least, even suggest that Iran will start direct negotiations with the United States in order to maximize their demands and not give the Russians the ability to use the negotiations within their own interest. But of course, the current government in Iran, the Raisi's government and the hardliners in Iran, they have no intention to agree, at least at this point, to any kind of direct contact with the United States. They keep saying that the United States is the one who is responsible for withdrawing from the JCPOA, so they are no longer a part of the JCPOA, and there is no way of direct negotiations between Iran and the United States. So they do say, and we've seen that over the last few days, saying that we the Iranians should use our good relationship with the Russians in order to give us more to support our interests. I would say that what we've seen over the last few days, and in my view, this is a very interesting issue, is that the Iranian officials and the Iranian media associated with the hardliners try to give the impression that it is not the Iranians who gave up some of their objectives in the negotiations, but it is the Western side who gave up some of their demands. And that seems to be very important because it might give the Raisi's government the opportunity to show mainly to the domestic public opinion inside Iran that we managed to get much more concessions from the West in comparison to what has been achieved by the previous government under Rouhani. And if that's the case, it might give them more incentive to say, okay, we are going to go back to the JCPOA. We've succeeded in getting more concessions from the other side. That's the time where we can go back to the JCPOA and have all the credit to Raisi's government.
Meir, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Well, there is concern in Iran regarding Russia's role. As Raz said, there are some quarters in Iranian politics which are not really, they don't have that much of an impact. The moderates and the reformists. They are one of the main reasons why they've been calling for Iran to have relations with America is because they believe that the Russians are exploiting the fact that Iran does not have relations with America and the fact that Iran is limiting itself. Iranians are not blind to the fact, and I'm quoting a recent newspaper report in the Jamhuri Islami newspaper, which is more aligned with the moderates, that the same, the Russians cannot be trusted. It listed of various reasons, and one of them is that they watch as pro-Iranian forces are getting bombed in Syria. Basically, the Iranians are very, they recognize the fact that the Russians' role in Syria is not exactly that of an ally when Israeli planes or missiles appear over the skies of Syria. But at the same time, the real decision makers in Iran are anti-Western ideologues. And of course, Trump, by walking out of the nuclear deal, proved them right in some ways. But even during Obama, there were very anti-Western initiatives being taken by Iran. I can give one example in 2011 when the Americans caught the Iranians planning to blow up to kill the Saudi ambassador in Washington in a restaurant, and the person who they arrested, the FBI actually watched him as he called his handlers in Tehran, and the whole case was brought before a U.S. civilian court, not even a military court, because the Americans had so much evidence of IRGC involvement in that plot. So the ation is that it's not going to change. The Iranians are going to continue working with the Russians and with the Chinese. There are people in Iran who are going to continue criticizing them. Another recent report is that apparently after many years, the oil field has finally been found in the Caspian Sea. This goes back to Stalin, who is believed that he wanted to force Iran to give concessions in the Caspian Sea for oil, but no oil was ever found until now. And there are beliefs that the Russians are telling the Iranians, you cannot use this oil, you cannot export this, gas, it's not oil, this gas to Europe. And Iran has gas that could export to Europe. And apparently after the JCPOA was in place and sanctions were removed, the Russians basically did not allow Iran to export gas via Turkey to Europe because they would have been their competitor. But as long as Ayatollah Khamenei and his cohorts in Iran are in charge and their hardliners are in charge, they're not going to allow Iran to balance its relations with with America, and the Russians and the Chinese are going to exploit Iran, and nothing's going to change.
Amir.
It is safe to assume that because we are only in the second or third year of this decade, depending on whether 2020 was part of this decade or not, it is safe to assume that Ayatollah Khamenei will not survive this decade. So sometime in the near to midterm future, we are going to have a change of supreme leadership in Iran. But because of the very history which Meir alluded to between Iran and the former Soviet Union, of course, it is not identical because Azerbaijan, which was part of the Soviet Union, is bordering Iran. And after World War II, the Soviet Union occupied that part of Iran which is adjacent to Azerbaijan. But nevertheless, the fear of Russia in whatever capacity is one of the dominant themes in Iranian history. And I'm saying that just to make the point that China is the wild card. Iran has nothing to fear from China. It may cooperate with China against others, especially if one looks towards mid-century when China and the United States are obviously the two leading countries in the world. So whatever happens between Tehran and Beijing can still upset the apple cart.
So we have Russia, we have China, and Raz, I'm wondering about what Amir just mentioned also, the change of leadership that was expected and has both happened in Iran. How does this impact these diplomatic issues now? A hardline president, the possible change of the supreme leader.
First of all, I have to say that Iranian clerics have the tendency to live longer, so I'm not sure that Khamenei is going to disappear in the near future. But you're right. I mean, if you look at the efforts made by the Iranian regime to guarantee that Raisi, the hardline Raisi, is going to be elected, or I would say selected as the new president, that shows us that the Iranian regime and Khamenei himself is certainly looking for the thinking what will happen in the near future after he goes away. So and that leads me to my sense that there are more and more reasons to believe that in the end, at the end of the day, Iran will go back to the JCPOA, because it's not that the Iranian economy cannot survive more months or years of economic sanctions. Former Foreign Minister of Iran, Zarif, once said that Iran has a PhD in dealing with sanctions, and he was right. And you can certainly see this so-called resilient or resistance economy, which had some successes over the two or 3 years. Having said that, even the positive indicators of Iranian economy are not sustainable, and that's the problem. And they certainly want to get more stability in Iran. We've seen those protests going on in Iran since late 2017, including during the last summer over the lack of shortage of electricity and water. So I would say that Khamenei really wants to get some kind of stability. It's not just President Biden who wants to bring back the nuclear issue back into the box. Khamenei also has an interest to make sure that Raisi will not deal with the ongoing talks in Vienna, but he will be more free to deal with the economy, with the protests going on, with the major problems Iran is facing. And the only way to do that, despite what Khamenei says again and again, we can do without the removal of the sanctions. But I think that he also understands that the removal of the sanctions is a precondition to deal with other problems. And that makes me more optimistic, or some would say pessimistic, over the prospects of going back to the JCPOA at the end of the day.
Meir, would you agree with that? Do you see Iran going back to that at the end of the day?
I think yes, absolutely. But the question is whether going back to JCPOA is going to be enough, because we saw the last time Iran reached the JCPOA, and President Rouhani was trying his darn best in order to get some foreign investment into Iran and to get Iranian expats back into Iran to work with international communities, because they understand the cultures of the Europe and America and Iran. But soon we saw the hardliners testing a missile with Hebrew writing calling for the elimination of the state of Israel. That's not exactly attracting investment, is it? That's the antithesis to it. So on the one hand, we are very likely, in my opinion, I agree with Raz, that we're going to go back to the JCPOA. But on the other hand, we often overlook the political economy of the Islamic Republic of Iran. What is as important ideologically to the Islamic Republic of Iran is its economic interests. And the economic interest of the IRGC and the people who are very close to centers of power right now with Khamenei and his successor, they thrive in closing off Iran's economy to the international community. They just want to have a very little, opening in order to have, of course, trade. But they want to continue ruling over Iran's economy. They want to continue selling their products, their cars, and the food stuff. That the IRGC today is involved in everything from laser eye surgery to missiles to manufacturing tomato puree. And I know this may sound very pedestrian to people who are used to dealing with missiles and nuclear weapons that we're talking about right now. to then control over the market is very, very important. And that's the only way they can continue to control the market, because they know that the Iranian consumer prefers the foreign products, which are, of course, better, is to continue manufacturing foreign crisis with Israel and with the Saudis. How long will that be sustainable? I don't know. I think they will continue doing their best. And here comes actually, I think, the longevity of this issue also has other downsides regarding China. We were talking about China before. Let's not forget that the Iranians rely greatly on China for the sale of their oil. They recently reached a 25-year agreement with the Chinese. But at the same time, China has other more important economic partners in the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia and Israel. Let's just look at the question of Saudi Arabia. The Chinese were recently caught helping the Saudis develop their missiles in Saudi Arabia. Who are those missiles aimed at? Of course, Iran. So the longevity of Iran's policies in the region will also bring the Chinese into contradictions, and they will have sometimes choose sides against Iran. But unfortunately, I have to say, on the one hand, yes, Iran will go back to the JCPOA, and I fully support that. But don't expect core changes into Iran's ideological posturing towards the US and Israel, because it's not in the interest of the political economy of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Amir?
As a certain musician from Liverpool once said, all things must pass. Regimes fall, systems of government are being transformed, South Africa, the Soviet Union, many examples throughout history. Why should Iran be different? Now, one cannot put a timeline on it, and it does not have a plug-and-play economy. If they are going to have better investments, more relations with the West and the like, are they going to endanger it, all of that when the sunset clause is upon us some 10 years from now? So yes, I agree with Raz and Meir. There is quite a prospect, I would say a certainty, that we are going to see a revived deal between the powers and Iran.
This is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank our guests, Raz Zimmet and Meir Javedanfar. Thank you both so much. And shalom from Jerusalem.